Hey folks, so I want to start the video today by asking you a really intense philosophical question, and here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about conflict and what makes conflict intense, and we're going to focus on a specific conflict here. So I want you to spend a minute or so here thinking about what is it that makes this conflict so intense? What is it about people that cheer for Duke that makes them such terrible, terrible people and makes me know that I need to avoid those people at all costs if I want to live a normal, healthy life? And what is it that I know about the Tar Heels that make them such amazing people that we instinctively know to stay away from the darker blue because it is such an ugly color? Okay, what is it about that conflict that makes it so intense? Well, I'll tell you. What it is about that conflict is that I can get in my car at the University of Chapel Hill and drive 15 minutes down the road and be in Duke country, right? And what it is that I grew up just over here, right? Just outside of Duke. I grew up just down Roxborough Road, and I can look at Duke University from where I grew up, and I was surrounded by Duke fans. And as a Tar Heel fan, surrounded by these nasty Duke fans, I knew that there was something intrinsically wrong with those people, right? And I knew that because they were so close to me, and I could see them every day, and it was disgusting, right? Well, basically, that's the French and Indian War. So as we're talking about this here, I want you to kind of think about that conflict. And part of what makes that Duke-Carolina rivalry so intense is how close down Tobacco Road Duke and Carolina are. Because that same kind of issue is what's going to cause problems for the French and the British colonies. So this war really begins back because of the two colonies. So we've been spending most of our time talking about the English colonies, but they're not the only ones colonizing the New World. The French have been colonizing too, and they've been coming into what is mostly modern-day Canada, down through this Midwestern part, down the Mississippi River Valley, and what today we call the Ohio Valley, okay? So the French mostly have trade routes in that area. They're really big in the fur industry. That's kind of what they've made their claim with. And so they are in this Ohio Valley. The problem is, as the English are beginning to become more populous in their colonies, they start moving westward into what is French territory as their population is getting bigger. Also, what we're going to see is that both of these groups are trying to have trade with the Native Americans in that region that they're both laying claim to, right? And there's going to be some conflicts with the Native Americans over who has the right to trade in that region. And just to top everything else off, it does not help that they are also already at war in Europe. So the French and the English are already fighting each other in Europe. And basically that's just not going to make them make the fact that they're living so close together any easier. So just looking at this map here, you can see that on this side, that kind of salmon color, that is the British territory, so the British colonies. The orange territory is the French colonies. And this green area is the colonies, or the land that they're both claiming. So both the English and the French are claiming that land. You can also see, if you look carefully, all of these words that are written in brown: Delaware, Shawnee, Powhatan, Fox, Kickapoo. These are all Native American tribes that live in that area. So you will notice that most of them are in both the disputed territory and the French territory. And the French are actually on pretty good terms with the Native Americans. So this is kind of where we are beginning. We've got the French and the English who are really close together, and they're starting to butt heads, and they already hate each other. So the fact that they're already pretty much hating each other and they're so close together is really going to cause it to go, right? So we're not going to look a lot at kind of how the war was fought, but I want to spend most of our time talking about some of the advantages and disadvantages that each side had in this war. So we'll start with the British colonies. So the British, or the Americans, their first major advantage is that they're a bigger population. The French didn't settle as much as the British did. So even though they have more territory, if you look back here, you can see the French actually have more territory. But it's not settled. It's mostly just traders, people who are involved in the fur trade, that are living here. And oftentimes they don't even stay. They go back. But the British have developed these colonies that are permanent. There's high populations in the cities, and so there's more of them. The other advantage they have are local militias. So these militias are not often well trained, but they're ready at a moment's notice. They're known as the Minutemen. And basically they are already prepared, ready to fight for the British. They can call them up at any moment and basically go into battle whenever they need to. So that's a big advantage that they have. They're also pretty self-supporting. The colonies produce a lot of what they need. They have their own food. They're able to live on their own land. So they're supporting themselves, food, resources, that sort of thing. Also, what they don't have in the colonies, they can get through trade. They can get from the seas. The British control the imports. They have the biggest navy, and they're the ones controlling what's coming in and out of the colonies. The French have some of their own advantages as well. They have one single colonial government instead of 13 separate governments. Sometimes the colonial governments didn't always agree on what they needed to do, whereas when you have one government, one French government in the colonies, they can make really fast decisions, right? They can change their minds really quickly. They can issue orders, turn of a hat. So that's going to make them more unified. The other thing that they have is that they are closer settled. They are settled much more closely together. They have some more fortified towns than the English have. So they're kind of, the way that they've settled, even though there's not as many of them, they're closer together and it's easier to defend. Like I was saying, they already have forts. They have fortified positions. And so these are going to be kind of advantages that the French have. Now, in terms of disadvantages, the British have colonial assemblies that can't always get along. Sometimes they don't like what the British are telling them. Sometimes, like Virginia and Massachusetts, can't agree on what they want. So there's a lot of issues with the colonial assemblies not being able to kind of solve those problems together. The other problem is that they're fighting an offensive war. In order to go to war with the French, they're the ones doing the attacking, right? They're the ones on offense. So they actually go into Quebec and Montreal in order to fight battles there. They're not defending their own territory. They're having to actually make the first move. And this is going to cause a lot of problems for them. In order for the French here, the French have a smaller population, so there's not as many of them. They don't have a lot of militia or things like that in order to support themselves. And they're depending on imports. And remember, that's a problem because if they're depending on imports for their supplies and the British control the seas, they're not going to be able to get a lot of their supplies. The British are basically going to be destroying any French ships that are coming in through the harbor. Now, in terms of their troops, they don't actually have a lot of their own troops. The French are focusing most of their efforts on fighting the war in France, so they're not sending a lot of troops to the Americas. So in order for them to actually fight, they have to kind of depend on the fur companies to defend themselves. Well, there's not as many of them. They're not well trained, and they're a business, right? They're not a military. So it's going to be harder for them to actually defend themselves. For each side here. Now, in terms of the Native Americans themselves, Native Americans were involved on both sides of this conflict. So I think that's important to remember. For the British colonies, they were allied with the Iroquois Nation, which was a big confederacy in the northern part Massachusetts area. Now, the Iroquois were mostly neutral, but occasionally they would come in and help fight with the British here. They stayed out of it a lot. There weren't as many of them willing to fight, but they were kind of willing to come in and help out every now and then. The group that did fight the most are the Mohawks. The Mohawks were led by a guy named Chief Joseph Brant, and he actually was appointed as a colonel in the British Army because of his work in helping out the British. So that was their main Native American ally. The French had many more Native American allies. The Algonquins, the Ottawas, and the Hurons are the biggest three groups that helped them out. And there's some reasons that they were more willing. First of all, they'd been trading with the French for much longer. They knew the French. They had good relationships with the French. And so basically they didn't trust the white land-grabbing settlers. Like these British people are just coming in taking land. They're not really willing to work with the Native Americans. They're not really supporting the Native Americans. So it's harder for them to get the support from Native Americans because they're not really doing much to help build that trust with the Native American groups. So let's get into actually like the first start of the war here. So we start with a young colonel in the British Army named George Washington. So George Washington is leading a group of militiamen out of Virginia, and his main job is to try and drive the French out of the Ohio Valley. So Colonel Washington, who is in the British Army, keep that in mind, leads his group of men to a French fort called French Dunkes. I probably said that super wrong. I don't speak French. But he tries to capture the fort. Well, it turns out that the French are way too strong for him. They are much more fortified, they have more men, more arms, and basically it's a major, major problem. So Washington has to retreat, and he runs back and builds a British fort called Fort Necessity, and he has to build it really quickly. Think about the name, Fort Necessity. I'm building this out of necessity. And while he's there, he tries to convince some of the natives to ally with the English. Can you guess how successful he is at that? Yeah, not very, right? Well, this all goes down when a French ambassador is accidentally killed. And because of that, basically the whole thing blows up. So there is a big battle that really is going to be the first battle of the French and Indian War over at Fort Necessity. And it really just kind of all blows up in Washington's face. And it's going to take him a while to rebuild his reputation in the army. So this is the beginning of the war. You can see here that this is the fort that he was trying to take. Here's where Fort Necessity is, so they're pretty close. This is the Ohio River Valley where they're trying to drive the French out. That's kind of some of that disputed territory there. So one of the things that does come out of this is something called the Albany Plan. And the Albany Plan actually is written by Ben Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin is a young politician at this time. And basically what they say is that the colonies are going to join together to help the British fight this war, right? This is a British war, but these are British citizens. The colonists are British. And so they decide that they're going to join to help the British fight it. And basically the idea is if we're not helping the British fight this war, then the French are going to take over the colonies and we'll all become French citizens. And we don't want that, right? So he releases, this is a cartoon, it's one of the very first political cartoons drawn by Ben Franklin. It's called Join or Die. And so he describes the colonies here as a snake, right? So if you look carefully, you can see this stands for New England, so all the New England colonies. New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. I said Massachusetts, I meant Maryland. So all of the colonies are basically being described as a snake. So if we are divided, if you think about a snake, you cut its head off to kill it, right? So if we are divided, we'll die. But if we all join together and be united, then we can be the ones who help fight back, right? So the Albany Plan is this plan that the colonists are going to work with the British. So just kind of what they're all fighting for. This is the last thing you've got here. So the American Indians are trying to maintain their lifestyle. They want to continue trade with the Europeans as they had before, but mostly they want to just kind of be left alone, right? They need land in order to survive. A lot of them are nomadic. They depend on hunting, that sort of thing. So they want to keep the English out, right? Because a lot of the English are coming in and taking that land that they are using for trade. They want to trade, but they don't want you to settle, okay? So they want to continue trading with both the French and the English, but they don't want the English to settle in this area because that's going to take away the land that they need. The French want to control the fur trade on all of the land that they claim, including that disputed area, and they also want to make sure that British traders are not cutting into their trade, right? So if the British come in and start getting involved in the fur trade, then that's going to take money away from the French, and they really don't want that. So the British want to settle. They want to move past the Appalachian Mountains and spread out a little bit more and settle that area, settle for farming and this sort of thing. They also want to kick the French out of the Ohio River Valley. They want to make sure that they are the ones controlling that area, controlling the fur trade, controlling everything that's going on. So this is kind of just the basics of the French and Indian War here, and it all goes back to a rivalry, really, between the French and the British, very similar to the Duke-Carolina rivalry. Basically, these guys already hate each other. They want to control the territory, and as long as they are button heads, right, then nobody's winning. So we'll be able to see in class kind of how this plays out and what it looks like. So I'll see you later. Bye.